Christmas Eve has always been a special time for me. My name is Thomas, and this time I was going to spend the holiday with my brother's family, who lived in the neighboring state. It was our tradition to gather around the fireplace, exchange gifts, and cook Christmas dinner together. I lived in a small town in the north of America, surrounded by dense forests, snow, and almost endless silence. My journey began late in the evening. I was a little late at work, so I had to drive in the dark. The car was not new, but always reliable, and I had no doubt that it would take me to my destination. The road ran through a dense forest, lit only by headlights, and from time to time, the snow sparkled under the moon. I was driving, enjoying the silence, when suddenly the engine made a strange sound and the car stalled. I cursed, stopping on the side of the road. The forest around seemed gloomy, but I did not see anything unusual in it. It was just a forest, dark and silent. I got out of the car, armed with a flashlight, to see what was wrong. It seemed like the engine was the problem. I leaned under the hood and started to figure it out, when suddenly I thought I heard something. A rustling or a light crunch of snow behind me. I turned around abruptly, shining the flashlight around me. No one, just snow-covered trees and absolute silence. I went back to the car, but the feeling of being watched did not leave me. Every time I raised my head, it seemed like someone was hiding in the darkness. Finally, I managed to fix the car. I was about to get behind the wheel when I heard a woman's voice. It came from the forest, quiet but clear. "Help!" I froze. My heart started beating faster. My mind was telling me not to interfere, but what if someone really needed help? I thought for a moment, but eventually decided to check. Turning on the flashlight, I headed towards the sound. The voice was getting closer. It sounded louder and quieter, as if someone was calling me from far away. I looked back and saw that the light from my car headlights was barely distinguishable. The forest seemed endless, and the frost penetrated to the bones. I continued walking, hearing this voice from time to time. The snow crunched under my feet. My breath escaped in clouds of steam. Suddenly, in the distance, between the trees, I noticed a silhouette. It was moving, but too quickly disappeared behind the trunks. I quickened my pace. The cold was already beginning to paralyze my body, but the voice, "Help," sounded more and more distinctly. Soon I saw a small house. Its windows were darkened, but the voice was clearly coming from there. I came closer, walked around the house, and knocked on the door. There was no answer. My heart was pounding when I decided to push the door. It gave in and opened with a loud creak. It was dark and cold inside. On the floor, I noticed footprints leading somewhere into the depths of the house. The woman's voice faded, but I thought I heard someone's breathing. I took a few steps forward. The flashlight illuminated old furniture, a broken table, and scattered things. "Is anyone there?" I asked loudly. Silence followed, but then the door slammed behind me. I turned around, shone the flashlight at the door in a panic, but there was no one nearby. And suddenly, I heard that voice again, but now it sounded right behind me. "Help!" I turned around and saw her. In the corner of the room stood a woman in torn clothes, with long wet hair. Her face was hidden in the shadows, but I saw her pointing her hand somewhere further. "What happened?" "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to understand what was happening, but she didn't answer. She just slowly turned around and walked into the depths of the house. I followed her. although everything inside me screamed that I needed to run. We came to the door that led to the basement. The woman stopped, pointed at it, and disappeared, as if she had dissolved into thin air. I froze in horror, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the basement door. Cold air hit me in the face. When I went down, I saw something that will forever remain in my nightmares. There were human remains on the floor, and there were marks on the walls, as if someone was trying to get out. And then I heard heavy footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw a silhouette, tall, holding an axe. His face was distorted with rage. I ran. My heart was pounding and my legs barely obeyed me. I ran out of the house and, stumbling, ran to the car. I heard footsteps behind me, but I didn't dare to turn around. Only when I ran to the car and started it, I dared to look in the rearview mirror. The house was motionless, and the forest was silent again. I left there without looking back. When I reached the nearest town, I told the locals what had happened, but they only looked at each other. One of the old men said that no one had lived in that forest for a long time, and the house. My name is Alex, and I am 23 years old. After college, I found myself in a difficult situation. I urgently needed to find a job to pay the bills and help my parents. After a long search, I got a job at a gas station in a small town. It was not my dream job, but it brought in a stable income. I worked there for only a couple of weeks when my boss assigned me to the night shift on Christmas Eve. Of course, I was unhappy. Who would choose to work such a night instead of sitting at the festive table with their family? But as a newbie, I could not refuse. The shift began as usual. There were almost no customers. A cold winter wind whistled outside, covering the windows with snow. I wiped the shelves, wiped the counters, and tried not to fall asleep from boredom. The hours dragged on endlessly until the doorbell rang, a sign that someone had arrived. I looked at the time. It was exactly 1 a.m. A man walked into the store. He looked to be about 45 years old. His appearance immediately caught my attention. He didn't look like a homeless person, but his clothes were unkempt and his gaze was strange and cold. The man slowly walked up to the fridge with beer, without saying a word. His presence made me feel uneasy, but I tried to remain calm. When he approached the cash register, his eyes never left me for a minute. He silently gave me the money for the beer, took the bottles, and left. A couple of minutes later, I looked at the surveillance cameras and made sure that he got into his car and drove away from the gas station. A couple of hours passed, and I had already forgotten about this incident. I started to feel sleepy. Everything was quiet until the phone rang again. I raised my head and was stunned. The same man was standing on the threshold. Only this time his clothes were stained with blood. My heart was pounding in my chest and my knees were shaking treacherously. He stood motionless, looking straight at me. "Sir, is there anything I can help you with?" I asked, trying to remain calm. But the man didn't answer. Instead, he turned and headed for the restroom. As the door closed behind him, I grabbed my phone to call the police. But as soon as I looked up, I nearly fell out of my chair. He was already standing in front of me, as if he'd appeared out of nowhere. "Do you have any tissues?" he asked, smiling strangely. I handed him a pack of tissues and, gathering all my courage, dared to ask, "What happened?" "I was driving down the road and hit a deer," he replied. "I was trying to help, but I got dirty." His explanation sounded plausible, and maybe I wanted to believe it to calm myself. The man got another bottle of beer, paid, and drove off again. I watched his car disappear into the snow. I never wanted to sleep again after that. I spent the rest of my shift listening to every sound until morning came. When I got home, the first thing I did was take a shower to wash away the stress of the night, and then turned on the TV. On the screen was a news report about a girl who had been found murdered last night not far from my gas station. I got goosebumps. Suddenly, I remembered the last-minute customer and his story about the deer. Was the deer real? Or was it a cover for something much worse? A little time passed, and later I asked my coworkers who had worked there longer if something similar had happened to them. One of them, Jack, chuckled and said, "You must have met the Christmas visitor. This guy shows up at the gas station every year on Christmas Eve. They say he was an ordinary guy until he lost his family in a car accident right before the holiday." I didn't know what to think. The whole story sounded like an urban legend, but what I saw last night was real, and I lived through it. After that, I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. I needed money. Write in the comments, what would you do in this situation?
My name is Jason, and I'm a 5-year veteran of the EMTs. Our jobs are tough, especially around the holidays when the call volume increases. But this New Year's Eve was special. And not in a good way. My partner Kelly and I were almost done with our shift. It was 11:45 p.m., and we were sitting at the base, waiting for the call that would tell everyone it was time to go home. We weren't in a festive mood, we were exhausted from a long day of work. A home-cooked meal from Tupperware containers and the occasional holiday movie playing in the background was all we had for New Year's. As we began to discuss our holiday plans, the radio came on. Dispatcher announced the call, "Emergency. Willow Creek area, 23, Bailey Street. Female, 30, unconscious. Time, 11:50 p.m. Kelly looked at me pointedly, last minute, of course. We quickly packed, checked our gear, and hopped into our old but trusty van. The drive to the address took about 15 minutes, but in the darkness and snowfall it felt like an hour. On the way, I tried calling the number that was called, but no one answered. This was already alarming. When we pulled up to the house, I felt uneasy. It was an old, dilapidated mansion, set apart from the other houses. The only source of light was a weak flash of fairy lights on the tree by the porch. It looks like no one has lived here for 100 years. Kelly muttered, getting out of the car. We knocked on the door. Silence. I repeated the same thing, but this time harder. Finally, the door opened, and a man of about 40 stood before us, his face pale, his hands shaking. She's upstairs. Please help her, he whispered. We walked inside. The house was cold and there was a strange musty smell in the air. The stairs creaked under our feet as we climbed to the second floor. The man followed us without saying a word. We entered the bedroom. A woman was lying on the bed, motionless and pale as a statue. What happened? Kelly asked, taking out the blood pressure monitor. She just fell. We were celebrating, and then. His voice wavered. I checked her pulse. It was weak, but there. We began to administer first aid. As Kelly hooked up the monitor, I noticed the man shifting nervously from one foot to the other. Something was definitely wrong. Are you sure she just fell? I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, his gaze darted to the door. At that moment, I heard the floor creak behind me. I turned around and saw a figure, another person, standing in the hallway, almost merging with the shadows. Who is that? Kelly asked sharply. The man paled even more. That's my brother. He muttered, but something about that answer was strange. Kelly went out into the hallway to talk to him, but he was gone. Just vanished into the darkness. We exchanged glances. Everything was starting to scare me. As I finished stabilizing the patient, there was a loud crash downstairs. Kelly and I rushed downstairs, leaving the woman under the monitors. In the kitchen, we saw that one of the cabinets had fallen, scattering dishes. But there was no one else in the room. Let's get out of here, Kelly whispered. This place is not normal. We went back upstairs to transfer the patient to the car. But when we entered the bedroom, it was gone. The bed was empty. The man was gone, too. We searched the entire house, screaming and calling for them, but found no trace of them anywhere. Then I noticed an old photograph on the wall. It was of the same man and woman. The caption read, Willow Creek, New Year's Day, 1952. We left the house in silence. The dispatch call seemed to have been erased from the system, as if it had never happened. Back at base, we both sat in silence for a long time. It was our last call that night, but the memory of it haunts me to this day. I think about that house for a long time after. It was like a dream, or we were just too tired from the day. I still haven't found an answer.